Good morning, all. Thanks very much for the invitation. Luke mentioned earlier on about winning the war against COVID. I think we all owe Luke and Karina a huge debt of gratitude, and organisations like Midlands Science for ensuring that we're sufficiently informed and educated, and that we have the confidence to seek out and demand vaccination and to ensure that we do our part. And it's one of the things I think that probably has maybe been overlooked a little bit this morning, is the importance of that communication, the importance of informing the public and ensuring that their concerns and their fears are allayed, and that they have the confidence to seek a vaccine. And so that's what I want to focus on this morning. I thought maybe given the remit of your SFI Discover project in terms of science communities, and that you want to engage the public in dialogue and discussion around understanding science, and that I'd probably maybe give your audience a little bit of a look around or behind the curtain in terms of what a team of research psychologists do when it comes to tackling something like vaccine hesitancy in a pandemic such as the one that we're living through at the moment. So as was mentioned, I'm a member of a very large consortium of research psychologists from institutions across the UK and the Republic of Ireland, and institutions in Spain and Italy and Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. And we came together at the start of the pandemic, the very start of the pandemic, with a collective decision and intention to monitor the psychological impact of the pandemic on our respective populations by conducting nationally representative survey research. And one of the early questions, I guess, for our team was, how could we as psychologists put our shoulder to the wheel? So while immunologists, virologists, vaccinologists, epidemiologists were monitoring the pandemic and were rallying to develop safe and effective vaccines, we asked ourselves the question about how best might we prepare for the arrival of a COVID-19 vaccine in the earliest weeks of the pandemic and the lockdowns. So we wanted to know how receptive the population would be ultimately, how much hesitancy we might discover. Obviously, we wanted to be able to inform those who are responsible and charged with the care of the general population. We wanted to let them know about how receptive the population would be to a COVID vaccine once they arrived. We also wanted to understand vaccine hesitancy and resistance. So we wanted to identify who would be hesitant and resistant, what characteristics would describe those individuals, and understand something about the psychology behind their resistance and the hesitancy. And very importantly, to understand where they source their information from and what information they trust, so that we can reach them and provide them with the necessary information to allay fears and to change their position. So we felt that a better understanding of the psychology of vaccine hesitant and resistant individuals might afford public health officials a more complete understanding of why these individuals think the way that they do, and provide insights to help design more effective communication strategies. So what is vaccine hesitancy? So the Strategic Advisory Group of experts from the World Health Organization have been looking at this for years. So vaccine and vaccination more generally prevent about 2.3 million deaths every year. And it's estimated that an additional 1.5 million deaths would be prevented if we could improve our vaccination services and our uptake of vaccines globally. So vaccine hesitancy is recognized as a serious problem and an obstacle to the success of vaccine delivery, and was recognized as one of the top 10 threats to global health in 2019, and has continued to be recognized as a very serious threat. And so they've defined vaccine hesitancy as a delay in acceptance or refusal of vaccines despite the availability of vaccine services. Now that seems quite clear and concise, but vaccine hesitancy as a phenomenon is an incredibly complex, multidimensional issue. And in order to address any hesitancy that individuals may have, or to allay fears and concerns, it's first necessary to understand how complex vaccine hesitancy actually is. So vaccine hesitancy is indicated and implicated in terms of perceived safety of vaccinations, an individual's perceived effectiveness of vaccinations, perceived necessity of vaccinations, disease risk perception, so whether an individual perceives risk in the way that they should and believes they should be vaccinated against that risk. Concerns about side effects, whether those are common side effects or rare side effects. Vaccine hesitancy varies depending on the type of vaccine that we're talking about. It varies depending on an individual's underlying health issues or contraindications that may be present. It varies depending on an individual's phobias and fears, largely around needles or medical interventions more generally, or blood. Varies because of religious issues, and various issues around parenthood and pregnancy and fertility and breastfeeding are also very important in terms of whether people consider vaccination. And then finally and importantly, individuals' trust in political institutions, in the scientific community, importantly, in healthcare professionals, and in the pharmaceutical industry. So trust in all of these organizations and individuals is incredibly important for determining whether people are receptive or hesitant to vaccines or vaccination more generally. It's also, in order to understand vaccine hesitancy, we have to know what information people are using, where they're sourcing that information, and how they're using that information. And importantly also, to be very sensitive to the historical, political, and socio-cultural context in which we investigate vaccine hesitancy. So vaccine hesitancy is something that varies quite dramatically from place to place and over time, and it's something that we need to be sensitive to. So the World Health Organization SAGE group kind of tried to summarize this and condense this in terms of the 3 C's model, whereby if we can understand confidence around vaccines and the convenience with which people can receive and access vaccines, and also issues in relation to complacency, whereby people accurately perceive risk and the benefits of vaccines, that we will be better able to tackle viruses and pandemics like the one we're in at the moment. So critically, all of that information, that kind of deep and understanding of vaccine hesitancy is necessary to appropriately inform the public health messaging that we employ and design. And kind of we will have been kind of encountered much of this over recent months in terms of how vaccines have been developed. It's interesting to hear Karina kind of mention the timeline in terms of the development, whereby a lot of concerns and concern or fears about the current vaccines for COVID-19 are about the speed at which vaccines were developed. But as Karina has so elegantly kind of identified and explained, that development has been going on for much longer than people may realize. So explaining and describing and educating the public about where vaccines have arrived from, how they've been developed, and their safety, their efficacy, about side effects is critical in order to address any fears, concerns, and to kind of ensure that people are more receptive to vaccines. However, unfortunately, there are many people in the population who are resistant to science communication in this way. So we commonly adopt a deficit model of science communication, whereby we assume that hesitancy may be attributable to misinformation, misunderstanding, ignorance. And so what we do, our first step, our first port of call, is to try and inform the population as fully and as clearly as possible with accessible, repeated information. But some individuals, and a significant enough number of individuals exist in the population that are motivated to kind of resist scientific information. And so the model I showed you earlier on about all of the risk factors is only one part of the problem. In order to understand vaccine hesitancy, we not only need to understand all of those determining factors, but we also need to understand something about the machinery that is responsible, the psychological and cognitive machinery that is responsible and underpins attitudes, not only in relation to vaccines, but in relation to climate change, in relation to other issues such as creationism or genetically modified foods, critical issues for science and for the general population. So if we look at some of these attitude roots, then we begin to see some of the things that sustain and maintain anti-vax attitudes in the midst of even the most compelling scientific evidence. So attitudes are kind of commonly identified as often as vehicles for defining one's core values. So the attitudes that people express and share with one another often are an attempt for an individual to kind of give you some sense of who they are as an individual. So they're essentially cultivating an impression of self, and the attitude becomes a means to an end. So whereby the attitude expression is essentially a social signal about who this individual is. So whether I am empathic, I am an individual, I'm rebellious, I'm not a sheep. And also kind of our identities in terms of who we are and the attitudes that we express also reflect our alliances and allegiances and our identity within social groups. So depending on who we are as individuals and the groups that we align with, the attitudes that we express often reflect the characteristics and the ideologies of the groups that we align with. So in relation to ideologies, several ideologies are important in understanding the kind of attitudes that are relevant in terms of vaccine hesitancy. So whether people have hierarchical versus egalitarian worldviews, where they are in social dominance orientation, their individualistic versus humanitarian worldviews, their free market ideology, the belief in a just world. And all of these factors determine how individuals view society and their place within society and how society should be structured. And often when their role, identity, freedom in society is disrupted, such as it has been through the pandemic, then people's personal costs and personal inconvenience in terms of many of the social mitigation measures, social distancing, hygienic practices, and vaccination lead people often to places where they experience discomfort and they're agitated and frustrated and angry about the situation. And they experience often cognitive dissonance at feeling agitated at the situation. So one way to resolve that dissonance may be to adopt attitudes and beliefs, for example, in terms of pandemics or conspiratorial views in terms of vaccines and the reasons behind vaccination. And they develop motivated skepticism. So people's attitudes are also underpinned by conspiracist worldviews. So these are beliefs that it is possible for vast networks of people to execute sinister plots in near perfect secrecy, and a unitary worldview that elites have malevolent intentions and engage in information subterfuge to push their hidden agendas. And so people, depending on who they are, their personal identity, their social identities, their underpinning ideologies, their vested interests, and the difficulty of a pandemic situation may adopt and may be amenable to and more receptive to conspiratorial worldviews relating to the pandemic. Also, as I mentioned earlier, people will have anxieties and phobias. So the attitudes that they profess and the positions that they take in relation to vaccines may be driven by these underlying fears they may have in relation to medical intervention, needles and blood and the like. So taking this type of information, kind of our team of researchers decided to look at vaccine hesitancy from a psychological perspective and begin to understand what vaccine hesitancy looked like in the populations of the United Kingdom and Ireland. So we sampled from a nationally representative samples in the UK and Ireland, over 1,000 individuals in Ireland and over 2,000 in the UK. And we've been following those samples over time. And we started with a very simple question at the start of the pandemic, the very start of the lockdown. We asked people, if a new vaccine were to be developed that could prevent COVID-19, would you accept it for yourself? And our respondents answered yes, maybe, or no to this question. And we classified these individuals either being vaccine accepting, vaccine hesitant, or vaccine resistant, determined by those responses. And in relation to that, the first thing we wanted to identify was how receptive the population would be to a vaccine. Now, remember, this is a year before vaccines, well, approximately a year before vaccines have been developed. And we're preparing to kind of inform the population about how receptive people are. And we could see that the populations of the UK and Ireland were comparable in terms of how many people were accepting, how many people were hesitant, how many people were resistant. And more people in the Republic of Ireland were resistant than in the UK. If we look at the devolved nations of the United Kingdom, we can see kind of concerning levels, kind of the earlier points of the pandemic, whereby vaccination acceptance was as low as 50% in Northern Ireland, and hesitancy and resistance was about 48%. And this again kind of highlights the importance of looking at the contextual context of vaccine hesitancy and being sensitive to the socio-political and cultural context within which you investigate this phenomenon, because there's notable variation here. And obviously we wanted to identify who these people were. So we were able to kind of analyze our data. And again, this is just in relation to the Irish data, given the time constraints of this presentation. So I want to give you an idea of what Ireland looks like in relation to our findings. And so we were able to identify that hesitant individuals more likely to be female in the 35 to 44-year-old age bracket and to have no history of mental health treatment. That resistance was characterized by individuals in the 35 to 44-year-old age bracket, and they were non-Irish in ethnicity, living in a city, earning less than 50,000 euros, and that they had voted for Sinn Féin or in an independent vote or in the last general election, and that they had an existing underlying health problem that would exacerbate their health if they contracted the COVID-19 virus. Very importantly, what we took an attitude roots approach, so we wanted to understand the psychology, so the factors that would sustain or maintain those vaccine hesitancy attitudes. So we were looking at a wide range of psychological factors, and we discovered that individuals who are hesitant or resistant were less trusting of experts, so that is scientists and healthcare professionals, and authority figures, so that is the state. They were more likely to hold irrational beliefs, i.e. religious and conspiracy beliefs. They were more likely to believe that situations in their lives are under their own control, so internal locus of control, to have a stronger preference for societies that are hierarchically structured and authoritarian in nature, to be more intolerant of migrants in society, to be more selfish, i.e. less empathic, to be more impulsive in thinking style and problem solving, and to have more disagreeable personality. So you can see that we've learned a great deal about the population in terms of those who are hesitant, resistant, and that this information can potentially be incredibly useful for tailoring and targeting our messaging for the population. We also wanted to identify where the population were receiving their information and how much they trusted that information. And while hesitant individuals were no different to those who were accepting of vaccines in terms of where they sourced their information, resistant individuals were significantly less likely to source information from mainstream channels and government agencies, and they're significantly more likely to source information from social media. And importantly, again, hesitant individuals were no different, statistically no different from accepting individuals in terms of vaccination, but resistant individuals were significantly less trusting of mainstream channels of health professionals, doctors, and government. However, doctors, health professionals, and the sources they trusted were the sources that they trusted the most of all sources of information. So we also wanted to look to see how this changed over time. So these were longitudinal studies. So we started our investigations in the earliest stages of lockdown in March, April 2020, all the way up to when vaccines were introduced in December 2020. And these 4 different time points gives us a kind of an idea of the proportion of the population that was accepting to the vaccine. So we could see that declined the closer we got to the introduction of vaccines, and that hesitancy and resistance started to increase proportionally in the population from each of the waves up to the delivery of the vaccines. Now, important questions again that we wanted to answer at this point, and there's a tendency to think of people's attitudes towards COVID-19 vaccinations as static, but the changing figures of vaccine acceptance that we've seen over time indicated that people do change their minds. So we wanted to model this longitudinal change in attitudes and identify who is changing their minds. And what we found was that there were 3 distinct groups. There were a group of individuals who said yes at the beginning of the lockdown and maintained that position right up until the point where vaccines were introduced. There was about some population, about 16%, that were resistant from the beginning and held that position right up until the point. So they were static and stable in their resistance to vaccines. And then there was another group that we called the movable middle, where they started with more positive confidence and attitudes towards vaccine receptivity. This declined and bottomed out in July, August 2020, and then recovered in late December. And again, so it's important to identify these groups in order to be able to recognize the proportion of the population that are receptive to vaccines and the proportion of the population who are entirely resistant, and those who may be reachable in terms of our public health messaging, and obviously what that public health messaging should look like. So we might think about tailored or targeted messaging. So researchers have referred to jiu-jitsu health messaging, whereby we use the underlying psychological factors that we know underpin attitudes to inform the public health messaging that we use. So first and foremost, the strategies employed by Professor O'Neill and Professor Barrett and Midlands Science and informing the population about where vaccines originate from, about side effects, repeating this information, that is effective for the majority of the population. But to the extent that vaccination skepticism may be motivated by belief in a just world, it might be useful to present lack of action as a violation of justice to future generations. To the extent that rejection of Western medicine is motivated by fears about injection and medical intervention, it might be useful to focus on the role of immunization in reducing the need for injections and medical interventions once people get sick. In relation to the extent that people have a conspiratorial worldview, it might be useful to acknowledge the possibility of conspiracies, but show how vested interests can conspire to obscure the benefits of vaccination and to exaggerate the dangers. And finally, to the extent that people reject science because they wish to present a self-image of themselves as critical and skeptical, it might be useful to communicate the inherently skeptical nature of science, or to portray anti-scientific thinking as examples of unthinking conformity. So, thank you very much for listening.